So welcome back, and thanks everybody for hanging in. I know these kind of panel discussions can be tiring, but I think it has been a very interesting 1.5 days. As you see, I'm not saying that process, and the plan was to have an all-female panel. So we could also have an all-male panel yesterday, but we visibly failed. It was said I cannot make it for personal reasons. I'll do my very best to replace her, but I must admit I did not have too much time to prepare, but I trust I have a very excellent panel, which is very confident in the matter, so I can trust them with the topic. I will not give a long introduction, but I guess, unless you've been living on another planet, you've heard of Gdpr, and it's going to impact us in some way. And of course, one of the things is, reminds me very much of what happened. The Data Protection Directive was approved, and the lawyers in my university called me and said, can you explain us what it means to have adequate protection? So this is a question they asked me in the early 90s, and I'm afraid that they were not very happy with my answer, because, of course, as a technician you say it depends, and there is many measures, and it depends on your key management and your system configuration and so on, so there is no simple answers. But I guess the same question is now being asked by practitioners, by journalists, by data protection authorities. So what Article 12 of Gdpr, 32 of Gdpr says is we have to take into account the state of the art, the cost of implementation, and the nature, scope, context, and purposes of processing, as well as the risk of varying likelihood and severity for the rights and freedoms of natural persons, the controller and the process to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure a level of security appropriate to the risk, and so on. So we have again this legal text, and the question to cryptographers, computer scientists, is also what does it mean now? And I guess in the end, of course, in this case, we'll find out by the courts or by data protection authorities, because they may give these famous fines of 4% of global turnover, depending on our definitions of what state of the art and adequate is. So I think we're going to see very interesting times ahead. And the other thing, of course, is the Privacy Directive, which regulation, where the Parliament apparently has approved this text, and now they're waiting for the Council. This is for protection of communications, as mentioned this morning. So this is what we're going to discuss, like what is the role of Gdpr protecting our privacy, but also what is the message we get from practitioners, from lawyers, to cryptographers, computer scientists, what shall we do, what are our obligations. Also there is topics as security and privacy by design, and so we hope to have a discussion on what those things mean. And so I have a very distinguished panel to help you understand this. And it's a pleasure to have as first speaker Athena Bourka from ENISA.
Thank you, Bart, and thank you very much for inviting ENISA in this very interesting discussion. First of all, I would like to, I have made a few points about GDPR and crypto, as is the title of this panel. And I hope we have the opportunity to discuss them during this hour and a half. So, first of all, I would like to say that in GDPR, the main protection principles remain exactly the same as the Data Protection Directive. This is very important because we have seen in many cases people fall suddenly understanding that they have to do something about privacy protection, like there was nothing ever before. This is not at all the case. The main thing that changes is, as Bart said, the fines, and this is why it makes it much more interesting, especially for the private sector. And of course there are some other important changes, but the privacy goals, the protection goals, are the same. Now, when it comes now to security and crypto based on security, Article 32 of GDPR indeed puts an obligation to data controllers to have the appropriate measures in place to protect personal data. Again, this is not new. They had exactly the same also under the Data Protection Directive until now. But what is maybe a bit different is that GDPR emphasizes a lot the concept of the risk-based approach, the risk assessment. So the controller needs to assess the risks for the rights and freedoms of data subjects, and based on these risks, to adopt appropriate technical and organizational measures. Again, this is not new. We also had that aspect in the Data Protection Directive, but now it is really very much emphasized, not only for security, but for the whole, let's say, perspective of GDPR. Now, encryption is explicitly mentioned as an example of possible measures that controllers should take. And here is the first point I would like to make. Exactly that encryption is only one possible measure, and it's not necessarily the measure for all cases. It is not a one-fit solution for every data processing operation. And I'm saying that because I have heard in several discussions lately, many companies advertising products that offer encryption, which is GDPR compliant, and so on, and a lot of discussion. And exactly because for most of the people, encryption and cryptography in general is like a magic black box. Sometimes they get the impression that, okay, by encrypting the data, whatever that means, we solve all the problems. This is not at all the case, and this is not the concept of GDPR either. So, a very good example here is the area of personal data breaches. GDPR puts a new obligation to data controllers to report personal data breaches, to notify personal data breaches to competent authorities, and notify also the data subjects, the individuals that have been affected. But makes an exception in the case that data are appropriately encrypted for the notification to individuals, because it considers that this minimizes the risk. However, as also the Working Party 29 recently published in an opinion about personal data breaches, this is relevant only in cases where the breach is a confidentiality breach. If we have a personal data breach that is related to the availability of the data, and the controller does not have any possibility to get the data back, the fact that they are encrypted doesn't minimize the risk for the rights and freedoms of individuals. That is, that their data have been lost. So, again, my point here is that encryption in GDPR is an important measure. It's not a measure for everything. It doesn't cover all cases, and it should not be presented like that to data controllers, although in many cases it is presented like that. Now, my second point is that also we tend, in the context of data protection, we tend to associate, let's say, privacy with confidentiality. This is natural, because this is the, let's say, the most important aspect of privacy, or at least a very important aspect of privacy. But GDPR is about all dimensions of security, as I said before. So also integrity and availability, and also, in that sense, cryptography is not necessarily linked to encryption. I'm saying that again, for the people in this room, I suspect many cryptographers, people coming from the technical side, this is very evident. But this is not the case again for data controllers, for people who are not acquainted with cryptography. So I think a very important area for cryptography under GDPR is also Article 25, the article on data protection by design and by default. This is a novelty of GDPR. It's a very important article, in my personal opinion, because I think that if we manage to have systems and services that are designed to be privacy compliant, and they have settings set by default to high privacy levels, we also minimize the requirements for consent and for many other legal restrictions, and we make services easier for the users. And I think that cryptography can play a very important role there. For example, in the whole area of pseudonymization or anonymization. GDPR, for the first time, mentions pseudonymization, pseudonymous data, as a specific category of data. And it puts some exceptions and lighter, let's say, obligations when the data are pseudonymous. But then the question is, what is pseudonymous data? How do we pseudonymize data? And how do we anonymize data? And again, cryptographic solutions and mechanisms can play a very important role there, and I believe it's a very important area to explain, to give practical examples, and to guide data controllers. Now, my third point, was mentioned by Bart also before. He said, he was asked, what is appropriate technical measures? What is appropriate, what is adequate. And the same applies, of course, for cryptographic solutions. And we still have the same question also in this regulation. And data controllers are asking, what should I do? Just tell me, give me the solution that I should apply. What is the appropriate measure? This is not possible to be done because, as I said before, for every data processing operation, we need to have a risk assessment to understand what are the specific risks for the rights and freedoms of data subject, and based on these risks, adopt appropriate measures. However, I think that in the area of encryption and cryptography in general, because as I said, there are many dimensions, it is very important to provide best practices and examples not only of the state of the art, but also of deployment and of practical application of cryptography. And I'm saying this because some years ago, ENISA made a study on cryptographic, the application of cryptographic mechanisms across EU. It was focused on e-government services. It was in 2011, this study. 13 member states participated, 75% of the EU population. And what we found there is, and I think that it's still applicable today, I don't think the situation has very much changed, is that in many cases we still have weak encryption applied in systems and services, and there is a very big problem with key management in several cases, and this is in many cases due to the fact that there is poor knowledge, and also due to the fact that the guidance and the references to cryptography are usually high level, and the people that are really asked to do them, the developers that are asked to implement these solutions, cannot do it in the right way. For example, there is guidance missing on initial configuration, also on long-term configuration, and these aspects affect, of course, seriously the level of security of the systems and services. Of course, there has been work going on over all these years. ENISA has also published relevant work in this field in cooperation with very well-known experts in cryptography. But again, I think that what we still miss is some best practices, common mistakes, practical applications that would help data controllers and the engineers working for the data controllers to implement encryption, and not only encryption, other mechanisms like pseudonymization, as I said before, in practice. And I think also what is missing is an EU-wide approach in that matter, because we have also noticed, also in the study that I mentioned before, later on as well, that member states still work a lot in isolation on this matter, and this is also a very important matter, especially when we're talking in the context of Gdpr, which is applied in the same way everywhere in Europe. These are some initial remarks, and let's hope that we can continue this discussion.
Thank you very much. I now want to give the word to Isadora.
Thank you very much. I am not a technologist, nor am I a lawyer, and I am not here in the name of the Internet Foundation in Sweden, where I am currently employed. Instead, my contribution will be based on my graduate research at McGill University, where I've been for the past 5 years. And I've focused in particular on the history of crypto discourse, or internet-specific encryption, as a site of struggles where we define internet freedom. And I've tracked actors and communities, specifically cryptographers, hackers, and technology reporters, and how they have negotiated or connected encryption software to different online rights. And this goes back through history from 1975, where the RSA algorithms were published and made available, taken away, so to speak, from the industrial military complex and made available in the academic community, and eventually taken out to the public through technology journalism. And this moves on later through Wired magazine, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and the various efforts that we also heard about earlier today through Bernstein and the court lawsuits, so to speak, and the different procedures that happened from the crypto wars. So by focusing on this, the status of encryption has changed over time, right? We do no longer classify it as war material. Instead, we've actually come so far as to talk about it as part of human rights, actually. So how did that happen? I mean, we talked in the beginning of this, and still actually today, a lot of the rhetoric remains when we talk about encryption as magic or this black box, and where did this come from? Who created this notion of encryption and technology, or just mathematics as these things? So this is actually work that is ongoing, has been ongoing for a long period of time. But I would like to say, by depicting it as such, when we talk about encryption as this mathematical force that will happen regardless of our intention, regardless of what we want, we also remove responsibility from actors, from... Oh, I was terribly sorry. Sorry.
Sorry, telling you not to tell what you're doing.
Sorry?
Somebody trying to censor your speech.
Yes. Yeah, so, yeah, by depicting it as such a force, we actually remove responsibility from, I'd say, both state actors, corporations, and individuals, so to speak, as in who is supposed to protect our data or our privacy. And, I mean, encryption is not bad in itself, right? And it has been classified as this dual type technology, right? It could be used for both good and bad. What happened over this period of time, when it came from the origins of discourse, or of crypto discourse as I portray it, is that it went from a very Anglo-American context, right, where the responsibility would eventually fall very much on the individual to protect privacy. But over time, when this also spread globally, we're talking about the war on terror, for example, and when global communication policy became harmonized in the early 2000s following this as well, we saw a counter-reaction to this through new uses of encryption as well. If we're talking about Tor or mass leaks, for example, through these actions, encryption now is connected also to journalistic protection of sources, for example, and now it became an issue of democracy or safeguarding our democracy. And this is where we are today. It has continued in this direction in the European initiatives as well. And this is what I find very interesting in the GDPR, how we now see a shift in also who is responsible of upholding these rights, as we cannot expect citizens or the public to have all the knowledge required to encrypt their data. Or some argue that we should expect that from everyone, that you should have this knowledge, but in reality, most people do not. So now with the GDPR, although as Athena pointed out, it's not that many things that have changed, but some have in the wordings, in the focus, and we very much focus on the protection of fundamental rights, and we focus on the data subject and human rights in a new way that we have not done before. And the responsibility and accountability now lies on corporations to uphold this, and member states to also ensure that they follow the directive. So yeah, this is where I will add my input to begin the conversation of today.
Thank you very much. Now we get technologist, Tanja.
Yeah, okay, Tanja Lange from the University in Eindhoven. So I would like to start as actually a citizen to say I'm actually very glad that we have this regulation here. I'm thankful for the politicians who pushed it through. As much as I think that is maybe not sufficient, it is getting much more attention on the issues of privacy, having a model of fines, having all the publicity around this topic is getting companies to listen. And of course it gets the spammers, it gets whatever scammers out who say, oh yes, buy our military-grade, government-approved crypto. If you have us, you're free from regulations. I actually started getting GDPR spam already, that my company needs to deal with GDPR. I don't know who in this room also gets a GDPR spam. It's kind of an interesting new development, but it tells me that people are getting aware about it. It also tells me that the spam has some interest group and that other people have recognized that there is a void that needs to be filled. Namely, the targets of the spam are probably companies that are afraid of the GDPR, that are going like, okay, well, maybe I have data and maybe somebody evil will come after me. What do I do? I should throw some money at somebody who has the solutions. So I think as a technology people, we need to provide solutions that need to be standards. I'm very glad to have ENISA on board here because, well, it's a European directive, and so I see ENISA as a representative or as a chance to actually get some European focus here rather than having everything again separated by nation states, because as much as I know that the Germans, the French and the British will certainly not listen to what ENISA is saying, maybe the companies who are afraid of the European regulation will actually listen to what the European Agency for Security, Crypto and so on tells them. And that also means that the technology people and ENISA, we have the burden to give good advice. That means we have to set standards, we have to set guidance, we have to say how to actually follow those things. Exactly what those companies with the spam are doing, saying, hey, if you buy our products, you are GDPR compliant. Well, it's spam, but there needs to be a thing which is GDPR compliant crypto, GDPR compliant implementations. Those companies that spam me are making it up, but there needs to be such a thing. There needs to be some seal of approval that yes, this thing is GDPR compliant. I don't think anything has been standardized as such, because it would mean that there is a standard for it. For now, it's a regulation that needs to have a more detailed implementation. Bart asked me to be on this panel, and one of the many hats I'm often wearing is being the project coordinator for the ECRYPT project, which is dealing with long-term security, so it's about post-quantum cryptography. And when I'm wearing that hat, I actually have a problem with saying that any crypto can be GDPR compliant. Because all the crypto that we currently have sitting around, all the libraries that are reasonably well maintained, I'm not saying they're bug-free, but at least they're much more user-friendly than the stuff that I do as output. All of those will not live up to many years of security. If you require that your data is safe and you're using encryption, so if you require, say, 30 years, there's a good chance that within 30 years somebody will have built a quantum computer. And all the crypto that we're currently using and that a good GDPR compliant standard would probably suggest you to use, say RSA, say elliptic-curve cryptography, all of those will be broken with a quantum computer. So if you want to have truly GDPR compliant crypto, we actually have to go one step further into something which at this point is still a research topic. It's namely post-quantum cryptography. NIST is leading the field in this case by having a competition running now, but that also shows how early we are. We're still in the process of figuring out what is good practice. We're still in the process of making standards. While NIST is doing it, there are also some recommendations, so other standardization bodies, ETSI, ITF, ISO are looking into it, but there is no thing which is like the everybody approved, this is what we believe. Wait, of course, we as ECRYPT have issued what we believe will be secure, but there's not the thing which any agency, be it ENISA, be it the German government, be it NSA, have put out as this is good. All they have currently put out is, well, these guys are definitely broken. We don't have these guys are definitely secure. So we also have a question which is still a research question and a usability question to bring the post-quantum research further into, well, high confidence and into usability. So to sum up, happy to have it. I think we need to have some best practices, and at the same time, with my post-quantum hat on, I will say that those best practices are not actually good enough for really long-term security.
Thank you. And we have Claire, who's also technologist, but is from industries, working for Intel.
I very glad to be here, and it's very difficult to live up to the excellent discussions earlier today and the last discussion yesterday. I am a late addition to this panel, so please accept some version of the brainstorm as a contribution. So I have a global position at Intel, and I spend a lot of time traveling to various geographies. And invariably, when I am in regions like Asia or South America or Australia, knowing my affiliation to Europe, one of the first questions I'm asked is about the European privacy and data protection approaches, and in the last 2 years it was Gdpr. Without a doubt, Europe has made an imprint on the world where it comes to privacy and data protection. Everything that we had since the 90s in the world, things like APAC privacy principles and resulting regulations in places like the Philippines or the proposed regulation in Thailand, they are certainly inspired very strongly by the European approach. Even if you look at the solutions, regulatory solutions in China, things that have come out under the PRC cybersecurity law that has become operational in June of the last year are also inspired by the European approach to privacy that has been studied very heavily by a number of think tanks in China affiliated with the Chinese government. Everywhere you go, New Zealand, Canada, Argentina, you see the influence of the European principles and regulations on the current regulatory environments in privacy and data protection in this country. Even when specific laws and regulations do not exist, the approach is typically inspired much more by the European view than by the US view that is more enforceable, more market segment or industry segment related. In the US instead you have privacy regulations for finance, privacy regulations for healthcare, and so on. So with that said, it's also important to understand the distinction between the words as they are used and what is meant by them. It is true that the European approach to data protection has been enriched by contributions from elsewhere. For instance, privacy by design comes from Canada. That's where it was originally put through by Anne. And things like risk-based approaches come originally from the US, where it has inspired a number of standards and regulatory approaches, such as the cybersecurity framework that was published by NIST a few years ago and refreshed last year. So these words, privacy by design, and risk-based approach are used all over the world, but they mean different things very frequently. For instance, the PRC approach to secure and controllable environment under cybersecurity law in China also has a risk-based approach. This is what inspires the standards that have recently been proposed by the Chinese national standard bodies. However, risk-based approach is based on completely different premises. The risk includes something that's called transparency and reproducibility. Well, in the view of the Chinese regulatory environment, the risks are reduced if a product or a technology are disclosed to the point where they could be completely reproduced locally. Well, this, of course, is against the trade-related laws and confidentiality laws in the rest of the world. Nonetheless, just the fact that we are converging on the same words is evidence of dialogue, and hopefully this dialogue is going to take us further. Another instance where transparency is used in different ways is the requirement in some countries to turn over the encryption keys in the name of transparency, or in some regulatory proposals that have fortunately been withdrawn, like in India a year and a half ago, to keep all the communications in clear text for something up to 90 days, if I remember the text correctly, in order to provide this transparency that is considered so valuable in the internet environment. So the world uses the same words, but with very different meanings. One could talk forever about the approaches that have been taken in Gdpr and how they are going to affect both the regulatory and the technical environment worldwide. We don't have time for that. So I would like to maybe focus a little bit on how, as always, in the case of GDPR and all other regulations, the technology is sort of a step ahead of what can be done by the regulations. So there are excellent technology suggestions in GDPR dealing with anonymization and pseudonymization of data, or data encryption, or access control, but all these recommendations deal with the assumption that the data source is going to remain static, and that the exposure of the users will be limited to one data source. However, this is not the case already in the current environment, and this is going to continue changing. Well, typically a number of data sources that need to provide information to each other. Some of them man-made and some machine-to-machine interoperate in order to provide the fulfillment of just one process. So the example that I have used several times over the years is still current. Well, think about a situation where you are contributing to a charity on your telephone as an anonymous donor. So there will be a large number of data sources associated with this process. And data controllers for some of these processes will need to know exactly who you are under the law. For instance, when you are paying with a credit card, the financial organization had to know your customer, and other laws have to know exactly who you are. So when you are initiating your transaction by calling up this web page from where you are going to make your anonymous donation, your service provider for your telephone knows exactly who you are, and they have to know that under certain regulations. Well, when your request travels from the PDP, that's the telephony, to the internet context. Identifiers need to be exchanged in order for this transaction to take place. So anonymization and complete pseudonymization are not entirely possible. When you are paying with your credit card, of course, your financial provider knows exactly who you are and the data, while it might be anonymized for the local purposes, still has to be presented as is in order to connect it with your specific requests. It's only when your donation is posted on the website to which you are donating that you are truly anonymous to the readers of that web page, of course, if they are not hackers. So you can see that in multi-domain environments, the approaches that we have developed that have been very useful for static data do not work anymore. And as deep analysis, artificial intelligence, all kinds of it, ontology and reasoning, as well as deep learning type of algorithms become more pervasively used, then it becomes even easier, no matter how anonymized and pseudonymized the data could be, to make conclusions about you and your usage patterns that are very insightful. And even more, being in the process of working on a number of ontology-based security projects, there is also the bias that we, the developers of those artificial intelligence tools and algorithms, bring into the process. So the bias could be against a certain type of user, even though it's not strictly speaking profiling. The bias could be against the privacy parameters in the whole system. So I think as we move forward and as people begin to consider the successor to GDPR, a lot of other issues will need to be taken into consideration. Multi-domain processes, the influence of machine-to-machine data with static identifiers, the influence of bias in the algorithms for, broadly speaking, artificial intelligence as they are being developed, and many more. So I think to conclude, I remember a slide that I have seen many times presented first by Alessandro Acquisti. It was entitled, "What is Privacy Anyway?" So not only the computing environment is evolving, it is also the concept of privacy that is changing. And if we are looking forward to what's going to be in GDPR 2, this is also something that we will need to take into consideration. I think it's an evolving environment. I think its complexity is growing. I think it's very interesting, and I believe it will continue to heavily depend on the progress in security techniques such as encryption. Well, interesting things like that.
Thank you very much for very interesting and insightful comments. Maybe I would like to ask Athena, Isadora, whether they want to comment on this. So I think from a legal point of view, it seems that GDPR made some progress. And, encryption is a good thing, anonymization is a good thing. But the technologists on my right side, they say, well, in fact, the current encryption will not be secure for 10 or 15 years. Anonymization in a multi-domain context or in many contexts is just a legal fiction. So is it already outdated before it becomes active, or how do you see this?
No, I don't think it's outdated before it becomes active. I think that this has always been the case, the situation. It will always be like that in technology. And that's why, coming back to what Tanja was saying before, I don't really think that we can talk about GDPR compliant products or services or tools. We can talk about GDPR compliant data processing operations, which may be using specific products and tools. And this is why I think it's very important to know very well the state of the art, to have examples, to be able to give practical applications of the state of the art, based on the state of the art of the tools that we have today. Of course, knowing that this will change. This is a continuous process. It's not an exercise that you do once and it's finished. It's something that you have to go back and back all the time. It has always been like that. And I think especially GDPR puts this dimension much more clearly onto the table, since it actually acknowledges that all the time you need to go through this risk assessment. You have to assess the risks for the rights and freedoms of data subjects, your processing environment, the security measures that you have in place, the state of the art, the cost of implementation. Of course, this is the theory. In practice, things are not so easy to implement, but that's why I think there is no perfect solution. It has never been a perfect solution, I believe. But again, that's why we should not be discussing about GDPR compliant tools. We should be discussing about possible solutions that would be used by data controllers to implement privacy compliant operations.
Do you mind if I answer? Yeah. Okay. So I'm happy to see that it's not black and white. On the other hand, when you implement fines, you need to have at some point somebody say this is not compliant. And how do you do with this if something is compliant in 2018? Because at our current state of technology, well, this is not great. We know it's going to be broken in 20 years, but hopefully it's only broken in 20 years. Now this person somehow is compliant. And at some point the policy changes. Are there going to be more guidelines? I think we do need to have an intermediate step. Just having GDPR is not enough. There needs to be somebody, and I would like ENISA to be that somebody, to say, well, if you implement this, you're good for 2018. Be aware that those rules will change. This is current best practice. You're probably safe from regulators if you do this. At the same time, we also have to help regulators. Yes, Tanja says in 30 years this is going to be broken, but it's still the best we can do right now. As much as I would like every healthcare provider to implement something that is secure for the 50 years that they have to keep it secret, I can't honestly say they have to, because we don't have the solutions ready. So how do we deal with this? It's a policy question.
So, I think that nobody, not ENISA, not anybody can give you this type of certainty. Nobody can tell you that if you use this, you're going to be compliant with the legislation. This is impossible. But again, I think that it is possible to define the state of the art, to be able to say that at this point of time, in 2018, this is the type of solutions we have in place for legacy systems, for future systems. This is how it could work under different scenarios and situations. These are some examples, and you can use them in practice. I think this is feasible, and ENISA or other institutions that are in the same position could be well placed, as you say, to do. But of course, there's a lot of politics also involved in this discussion. But again, even if ENISA or someone else would do that, it would not give you this type of certainty that if you use this particular tool, you're going to be compliant. Nobody can give you this certainty. Because the use of the tool is very much related to the context of what you're doing. The same tool may be appropriate for a particular operation, and in other cases, not. Or it could not be necessary, because the risks are very low and there's no need to implement a very costly solution. Whereas in other cases, it should be the one being implemented. So it's vague, it's difficult. I don't know how in practice this will be done. I'm not a regulator. I don't know how they are going to impose fines, because it is indeed a very difficult area, especially if you consider, okay, security, maybe it's a little bit easier in the sense that we do have some standards, but if you think about privacy by design, for example, it's very hard to say how to design privacy compliant products right now. And I really don't know, and I think the regulators also don't know, and we'll see that in practice, how this will be imposed, and if what that to fines and how this will be implemented in practice. But again, I think that it would be very useful. It doesn't matter, in my opinion, if someone cannot give you this silver bullet and tell you, oh, okay, you do that and you're fine, you're safe. Even if we don't have that, it would be very, very nice to have practical solutions, state-of-the-art, which we also don't have. And I think this is an important problem as well. If we have that, it's already a very, very big step, in my opinion.
For Bart to comment on?
Yes, I mean, allow me to be a little bit critical, but I have just seen over the last few months a few real examples, and I would ask the panel what would you advise with this program? Probably you know about this connected intelligent transport systems, connected cars. Now it turns out that after 6 years of discussion, and a solution where the cars identify themselves, because they have to be trustworthy, because the cars have to be real cars to avoid cyber attacks. They use something which I would simplify as a certificate or electronic number plate. But to be sure that they are data protection GDPR compliant, each car has a random number, has a number of random identifiers where only the link between the identifier and the real car can be made by the certified authority. Now the issue is that everyone would expect this to be working, because the car can just take an electronic number plate whenever it wants. Now it turns out that Article 29 Party, which is the highest authority on the GDPR in Europe, has a, I would not say negative because then people start to criticize me, but a non-favorable opinion on this approach. They say this is not good enough. My question is, if these people who work 6 years on a solution propose something which then turns out not to be good enough for the GDPR, how could someone else in a real organization find solutions that are good enough? I mean, don't you need anything more than just a high-level legal framework to convince? I mean, I will give you another example. There's a lot of progress being made today in big data mining. One area which I know from I mean, you probably also know is in medicine. When you follow a lot of patients, like heart attack patients, over time, and with the treatment data, you will learn more about how effective a treatment is. So you will be able to save lives, or at least extend lives with a lot of months or years. Now, today, you can still share data from patients, but if you cannot decide on encryption or pseudonymization of the data, in the future, no university center will share data of patients with another center, because as soon the data leaves their own local server, there's no data controller who will take responsibility anymore for what happens with the data. So how would you solve this question?
Who wants to respond to this?
So towards the last one, even under GDPR, the hospital would need to secure the data. It's not just about data sharing, even collecting the data at the hospital would require them to have it in some form encrypted or pseudonymized. I don't know the detail for the other comments about license plate.
But this is the first step. Take the case that you are migrant. Yes. This is the first step, and this happens today already. Take the case that you are the data controller of one of the big university hospitals. You will say, as long as the data stays encrypted or unencrypted on my own environment that I control, I can take responsibility. It's already the first step, because maybe some of them will say yes to it. But the data mining becomes interesting because you don't share the data of those 500 or 1,000 patients that you know. You share the data of all the university hospitals over Europe, or even wider than that. And then it becomes interesting because you have much more data to go.
Sure, it's certainly
This no one will do it anymore, because when the GDPR with the fines comes in, I don't see any.
So to start with, of course, more data is better if you have big algorithms, but even using big data on your small data set, like if you want to have any learning algorithms, does have a problem for anonymization of the data. I think one problem in those is that many suggestions, be it for license plate readers or be it for healthcare data, use systems in pseudonymization, which are, even if they have like people working on them for 6 years, are often not very strong. So I don't know the case about these license plate readers in general. I have seen several studies going into, okay, here's a worked out pseudonymization system. Every data gets, every human, every thing gets a unique identifier, so it's pseudonymized, and then we still get the correlations. Now, you mentioned big data or machine learning or AI as a positive thing, but it's also a thing that you can run on those pseudonymized systems, and then the problem is you're getting some information which allows you to reveal who this person was. And that is usually the problem. This is usually why we consider those systems broken, because you can still get information about who it was. So whether you get the car a unique tag or a changing tag, if you can still figure out which car it is, then that system is just not good enough. If you have a healthcare system and you anonymize the data in some way with some system, and you can still later on find out it was, oh, that person there, oh, it was Felix. He had 2 coffees after lunch. That is not good for his heart condition. And then the health insurance finds it, then you have a privacy problem. So it wasn't a problem when it was user ID so-and-so and so-and-so, but because they followed your daily patterns, so you go to the European Commission every day, they figure out it was actually you. So those are the things where pseudonymization often just isn't good enough, and therefore it doesn't meet the GDPR. It's not because these people aren't smart enough, or it's just maybe pseudonymization is not the right approach. Maybe you have to encrypt the data. And then you have a much harder problem, namely search and encrypt the data. And then you get into, well, we're making the life difficult.
I would just like to say also that I follow it also what Tanja was saying, that in many cases, I mean, you start the discussion by saying, let's say, GDPR is a barrier for these processes. I think that, I mean, right now it is law of the European Union. So I think we have, in my opinion, we need to do the opposite. Start and look at it as another way of doing things. I mean, at the end, we will continue sharing data. We should continue sharing data because this is a very important thing for many other reasons, not only privacy that we need to protect, but many other things as well. And values and health, for example, is a very important one. But we need to do it in a different way. And sometimes this is not very easy because it needs to change the way that things operate. And this creates frictions in many cases, but however, there are ways to do things differently. It has been proven in practice in several instances. And also, I would like to say, for the example with the cars, you said, I'm not really familiar with the case, but I think that in many cases these problems arise because people do not consider by design this type of issues, including security, the strength of security and different options and solutions that they have. And it doesn't matter how many years you work on a case. The point is if you have the right aspects addressed at the very beginning. And for example, we're having during the break a discussion, some colleagues here on mobile apps, which is again a very, very important area, and there are a lot of concerns and many actors involved and so on. Again, if you don't start by looking at the design at the very first step of how you design these apps, how the operating system works, how the whole ecosystem works, then of course you're going to end up with solutions that are not compliant. And then if you go to the working part 39 or whoever is going to be after the European Data Protection Board, they will say that it's not compliant. But this is not just because they want to put GDPR as a barrier. I think, again, this is, I mean, we should not be looking at that like that because at the end it doesn't solve anything. I think we should look at this again as an opportunity to change the way we think and take the privacy calls seriously, take them into consideration by design. That's why I said already from the beginning, I think that this concept of data protection by design and by default is a novelty of GDPR, very difficult, in my opinion. I don't know how practices will be implemented, especially because in GDPR the obligation is to data controllers and not to technology providers and not to service providers, right? So I think this is a big issue. We will see in practice how this will work and if it will work. But I think that this is how we should be starting, and maybe we should try to think design in the context of data protection or data protection in the context of design, both.
Yeah, I think Leuven and Tanja raised very good issues. It's very difficult to create specific compliance recommendations for broad regulatory frameworks that are based on principles. There is simply no direct connection between principles and specific technology actions that someone has to take. These actions are best practices or some semi-arbitrary requirements. These actions certainly should not have been based on specific technologies, and GDPR does the right thing by suggesting technology approaches but not requiring any of them in order to achieve those issues. So I think it is an issue not just for GDPR but for a number of laws and regulations that are designed in the same way, and there are quite a large number of those. Let's talk for a minute about privacy by design. A good concept that was started some time ago. There was no trouble defining it in terms of principles. Untitled came up with 7 principles of privacy by design that no one really disputed. After that, there had been a number of research and practical projects that actually attempted to transition from those principles to specific best practices. What does it mean to design something as private by design outside of general best practices? That proved to be impossible. Very useful insights were gained, but not something that allows someone to say, oh, okay, today I'm going to build a new system and it will be private by design. What actually happened instead is that privacy began to be considered as an essential design objective from the beginning. In different ways. As far as I know, all the large technology providers now have a privacy review together with technology review and security review. Intel has had one for more than 10 years, and no technology goes out without being approved by this review board. This is true for all the other companies I know, including the ones that are usually targeted for issues with privacy in their approaches and technologies. So what happened is not a prescriptive way to decide, okay, I'm compliant with privacy by design. But what happened is a certain level of awareness to design in privacy features to the extent it is possible and to the extent the current knowledge allows us to do. Of course, systems are used then frequently in different contexts and for different goals. The technology environment changes and revisions to best practices are needed. But I think it's important to understand that there is no prescriptive relationship between the laws like GDPR and the compliance environment that needs to be created by those who are subject to GDPR compliance. It's complex, but it's not unique, and for the environment at large, it's very useful.
Yes, I mean, of course this is a panel on crypto and GDPR, but it's also important to remember that it's not only about the tools and having the tools being compliant. The implementation of GDPR on an organizational level will be massive and very difficult for companies and organizations to manage, because it has to happen on so many levels. Sorry. Within an organization, it implies also new practices on how this is implemented, and regular practices, routines, understandings, knowledge sharing of what this actually means. So yes, the tools are absolutely necessary, but then again, this is also an organic process. If we do not have compliant tools readily available for all to implement immediately, this will be an ongoing process where organizations will live and learn, so to speak. There will probably be a few cases within the first 2 years after implementation where we see failed cases and successful cases and where we can go towards. And then also I'd like to echo the point here of when it comes to having principles to work towards, the imaginary of what we are going to develop really, really matters in sense of what we will have as technology in the future. And it helps to have this directive to follow and to imagine that now we need to develop appropriate tools that can follow this. Although these will also, the requirements, the needs of different organizations will also vary. So it will still be depending on that. And lastly, also yesterday in a panel there was mentioned a certain fear that these things can come to stifle innovation. But we also see that there is a higher need now for this type of development, and there are already companies and startups starting to develop both laws or work around this and the technology for, in particular, GDPR. So I think we can just encourage this future development.
I think Flora gave some very good examples. I mean, I just can maybe some brief comments on this. I think we have also non-privacy by design technology, which is called a license plates, and everybody is forced to have one. And today, with cameras, any smartphone can recognize the license plate. So I think maybe also Article 9 committee should look at this, and are they going to forbid license plates or make this, do these electronic identities make it so much worse? And maybe this balance has to be made. For the medical data, I think, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I think there is a consent principle, so if the patients agree, there is no problem. I think there is a point of pseudonymization. This is also a way to escape, and I think for the future, there is quite some research on how you can actually do multi-party computation or matching on encrypted data, and I think this is a way in which you can, everybody keep their own data in encrypted form or protected form, and you can still compute it. And I think these are technologies we have to work towards. And maybe it's a bit advertisement for research, but in fact it was research we did together with George Janessis and Eleni Costa from the panel this morning. And I think it's now about 10 years ago when we looked at insurance pricing. So more or less, if you're 18 or 19, it's pretty hard to get car insurance. And the model was that you got a box in your car which monitors your behavior. And in fact today it's an app, no longer a box, it's an app. And more or less all your driving behavior is sent to the insurance company, and if you behave nice enough, then you'll get a discount. Well, what we showed, and we built the system, because we knew people would say, oh, this is not practical, we built the system 10 years ago, where all the data stays in the car, and you still get your discount. So the device in the car measures your behavior, decides whether it's dangerous or not, whether you're driving weekend nights, whether you accelerate too much. But the data stays local. I think it's a very good example of privacy by design. I mean, it's been quoted by several privacy technologists as an example of how you could do things. And I would think, as a naive engineer or researcher, that you could now say, following GDPR, you have to do it this way, and you can no longer collect as insurance company all the data. But we also know when we went to present to the Commission with this scheme, the police was there too, and they said, we want all the data. And I think that's the core of the debate.
So just a light-hearted comment on the car data collection and its influence on privacy and privacy perceptions. I think, it validates the idea that privacy, just like everything else, has to be considered as an advantage, a benefit to the data subject in order to be meaningful. So the example of providing the data while driving to the insurance company in the US, this is available to anyone. All insurances offer a discount based on putting this little contraption in your car. And the data actually is kept in the car. However, the take rate is minimal. Almost no one agrees to have this contraption in the car because the general perception, according to the surveys, is that even though the discount is offered upfront, longer term it's not going to be to anyone's advantage. Well, people who have no tickets, no violations are the ones to whom this contraption is offered. So it's not a direct connection to someone who has multiple violations. So contrasted with something where the benefit was immediately clear, also in the US, the Do Not Call Registry. So this is something that asked you to submit your telephone number and personal information to a registry after which telemarketers are not going to call you. So obviously for most people, the benefit outweighed the risk of sharing personal information. In the first day this registry was operational, I think something like 20 million people submitted their information. And in the end, it amounted to essentially everyone who noticed that this was available. So this, these two examples are very congruent with what Alessandro Acquisti discovered in his experiments on economics of privacy. Privacy, just like any good or service, is based on the perception of benefits rather than the usefulness of principles to the data subject. So I think it's an interesting thing for the researchers to consider, probably also for the regulators to consider, because the data subjects also play some part in enforcing privacy. I don't think it has direct relevance to GDPR, but it's interesting.
Maybe we go to the microphone. Question in the back.
I very much like what Athena said about GDPR should be connected with processes and not with technologies. Because we've seen over the years, like the cryptographic algorithms and the standards change, because the strength of a cryptographic algorithm is a function, depends upon computing power, intention, how much money is available. So throughout the years we see DES was a standard, was replaced by the advanced encryption standard. Now we will see the advanced encryption standard will be replaced by another encryption cryptographic algorithm. We'll see what this competition will come. So connecting GDPR with some type of technology is definitely a mistake. GDPR should just say, for example, we want the privacy level to be this and that for this type of data, for sensitive. So you categorize the data, and then according to the categorization of the data, then you just impose the privacy level, and that's the indication that it needs to be undertaken. So, trying to talk about strong cryptographic algorithms, things will change, as they always do. So there's no point of looking for the best. That's my first point. My second point is, the problem in Europe is for risk assessment. Member states do not use standards. They do not, for example, the NIS rate, okay, it has not imposed to use some type of standard for your risk assessment. GDPR does not impose some type of standard. When in the States, as you heard, we have the NIST. People use NIST. The companies use NIST, French Security Framework, as a standard. In Europe, every organization, every insurance company, that's where the biggest problem is. They use different methodologies for risk assessment, but some of them are not even not even implement the ISO 27001 or 005 standard. So my problem is here that how do you mitigate privacy risks when they have risen from different risk assessment methodologies that cannot be comparable, and you cannot actually homogenize the final result, like the privacy, the level of the privacy risk for this asset using this one methodology. It may be different if you use a different methodology, and actually you cannot compare the risk levels. So my question is, how will the controllers will be able to compare the levels of privacy risks? I don't know.
Actually, you raise a very important point, because first of all, in GDPR, we have a very big difference in risk assessment compared to the traditional risk assessment, and this is the fact that the assessment is performed for the rights and freedoms of data subjects, not for the organization. So this is a very big difference, because when assessing the rights and freedoms of data subjects, you have to consider all possible impacts to the persons concerned. And again, it's very different from the organizational risks. Sometimes might even be conflicting, depending on the case. It is true that we do not have a common standard of what is considered high risk or medium risk or low risk. And from past experience, when I was working for a data protection authority, I can say that even in the working party 29, data protection authorities cannot decide between themselves what is medium, high or low risk for the rights and freedoms of data subjects, because in many cases this is also a strongly cultural aspect. So this is a big issue, and indeed we will, in GDPR, this notion of risk is reflected in many aspects, not only in security. Here we're discussing about security, but it's reflected everywhere. For example, the notification of personal data breaches is on the basis of risk. If there's no risk, you don't need to notify. If there is high risk, you notify the data subject. But then, what is the perception of this risk, as you say? I think that this is something that needs to be set at the EU level. Different methodologies exist on this and proposals. ENISA has also made a proposal on that matter, by the way. It was a relevant report for risk assessment and security measures for personal data was published last year. But also we have different methodologies from different data protection authorities. For example, the French DPA has issued a privacy risk management framework, the EDPS has a relevant approach, and so on. It's an ongoing discussion. I think it's a very important one.
Tanja, you want to say something about the crypto? Yes.
I do want to say something about crypto, but I actually wanted to start with the second point and say that I don't think that our three standpoints are so different. It's just we're coming in with different tools. I come in with the tools of cryptography, so when you tell me you would like to have standards how to assess risk assessment, then I assume the next step already, namely that those standards of risk assessment then get translated into the constructive side. How do I achieve that I mitigate this risk? So for me, seeing what the risk is instantly translates into something where I can use my tools as a cryptographer and say, aha, there's a risk of data breach, it is necessary that the data is encrypted, then for this security level, or you would say for this risk, what technical solution would I suggest? So I think we're in sync in there needs to be regulations, except for the two of you, it seems to be you would like to have regulations on the risk assessment basis, and for me, it would be the next step that I translate the high risk, low risk, medium risk into here are the best practices, here's the guidance. Because in the end, you have somebody at the data protection agency who has to assess the technology, and they will not come in with a PhD in crypto. Not that a PhD in crypto is alone enough, but I mean, they will still need to have some guidance on what can be considered sufficient to mitigate this risk. Regarding your first point, I find it a little irritating when I hear people saying, oh, the crypto always changes. You mentioned DES, which is from 76, and you mentioned, oh yeah, it changes all the time. So we had one change from DES to AES in the early 2000s, and even when I talk about post-quantum crypto, there's no change necessary to AES. So it's basically one change in the whole history of crypto as far as we have it in public. So it's nothing which is like, oh, this is so volatile, we need to have new things all the time. As one of the outputs of projects I've been involved in, so ECRYPT, and then when we didn't have ECRYPT, it was ENISA, and now it's back to ECRYPT, and hopefully back to ENISA at some point. We've been issuing the European recommendations on key length. That document has not changed much. Of course, if we're doing an update, we're looking at new attacks, there is work each time to assess whether this is still true. But if I look over the years that I've been involved in, like early 2000s, and I look now, our recommendations of how long the keys have to be have been the same. We always say we have to implement 128-bit security, and 128-bit security have always translated to the same sizes for RSA, ECC, and Diffie-Hellman. What is changing now is that we're saying those systems which we understand well, and it's really one kind of crypto. For those, we need to have replacements for long-term security. But again, this is going to be one change, and we better get it right, because we don't want to change all the time. It's very much not the nature of crypto to be flip-flopping all the time. It's something which is extremely stable. All of those systems are from the beginning of crypto. The youngest one is from 85, and we're now looking at one change to those systems, not AES, the other ones.
Just a short comment. I understand the comment from the audience differently. Not the stability of the crypto, but recommending specific crypto algorithms or crypto approaches as a foundation for being compliant with GDPR, and that certainly shouldn't be done because the environment is different, the contexts are different. You don't want to require, I don't know, everyone to use AES with a certain key length in all situations. So I think, well, many standards like TCP/IP have been stable, but it's there are applications in certain environments that is different. So I think the comment about GDPR not requiring specific technology and this being a positive, both from me and from the audience, was about a different aspect of the situation, if it makes sense.
I think the difference is between require and guidance. I'm saying guidance is necessary, telling people if you use crypto with at least 256-bit AES or so, you're good. Whereas you're saying, well, this might be overkill?
Yeah, potentially. Well, think about using crypto in a one-time use sensor that connects once, right? And that has very limited computing power that should be focusing on metrics rather than encryption. So there are many situations like that.
There's a question in the back.
I'm not sure if it's already talked about this, but the question, I think one of the challenges raising from the GDPR for crypto is the addition of data and other things that you have to do in order to fulfill the base of the reason why you actually process data. So I've seen it a couple of times when people talk to me about some DLTs and how great that is, but they didn't seem to understand that there are only two reasons why you can actually process personal data, either consent or legitimate interest. So if you have consent, if the data subject rule sets away, I have to be able to actually delete the data. So if I have systems that can't do this, they are not GDPR compliant. So that also means, so you really have to look into how you deal with it. And I think that is actually a real challenge because it is not how you perceive most of technology as someone who buys or buys crypto consultancy.
Thank you. Who wants to respond to this?
I think the deletion is another aspect. I was focusing on keeping the crypto secure. Of course, that is, I think, still an important aspect because before you can delete something, even if you have it, it has to be secured. I think for the deletion, it's another area which is studied. There's the easy solution. Everybody has a single key, and then the key gets deleted and it gets re-encrypted with some other key, so it's overwritten. But of course, depending on what you do with the data, it might be pretty hard to delete all traces. No question about that. So we didn't cover that topic so far. I was covering the basic like data at rest, how to secure that. But I mean, on the positive side, hey, we have research problems.
Yes.
Maybe I want to bring up one final topic, which is not really crypto related, but you may have noticed that this month the US Congress has reapproved the FISA Article Software with a new PRISM program. And Blair touched upon international issues related to privacy. So you may know that Max Schrems won his case against Safe Harbor, and then the consequence was Privacy Shield, which I don't know whether you saw the talk of Max Schrems at CCC conference, but more or less he says it's the same thing, and so he starts over the same legal battle. Of course, we also changed the legal frameworks now. Does this change anything, or are we just back to as good off as European citizens if we use cloud service providers? In fact, our data end up with the NSA anyway, in spite of all the nice legal initiatives of GDPR and companies being in panic and everybody feeling good about it and we being a role model, but in the end, your data is with the NSA. Is that maybe too cynical view of a cryptographer, or how should we look at this?
Well, I don't have a clear answer to this. Obviously, as was pointed out today, the NSA and other intelligence agencies operate in a way where they get access to data in a way that are not always very well understood. But I don't think, from the business point of view, and as someone who looks at how data exchange systems are organized all over the world, the data protection systems, this includes everything. This includes information about your devices. When your technical support call is answered somewhere in India or in Malaysia. This includes exchange of information between countries for reasons that do not allow a lot of support for privacy, such as obtaining a visa to Russia. What happens to your information afterwards? This information certainly allows to easily re-identify you in a variety of situations. I think, since we are living in a digitally enabled, interconnected world where data exists in the cloud, where the same cloud systems are used to provision content to a variety of contexts and in a variety of situations. I think the issue that we are facing here is considerably broader than the NSA or BSI or GCHQ having your data. I think this is just a small part of what is going on and what makes us susceptible. I don't have an answer other than it is necessary today for everything from the planes flying to multiple destinations all over the world to having self-driving cars using maps to everyone connecting to the same data points in data centers when they are using Google and so on. I think this is a problem that touches everyone in all manner of contexts. That is a problem that is very complicated. I am now not looking at encryption, but at the kinds of data that need to be exchanged in order for systems to operate. I don't know if you remember the search for MH370, right? And how much data, both about the passengers and about the location of the aircraft, had been available through a variety of devices. Much of this data was collected under regulatory premises. You also may remember how much of this data was wrong. For instance, two of the passengers who were boarded as a German and an Austrian, I think, ended up being two Iranians traveling on false passports. So I think there are a plethora of issues, and while it is important to be aware of the government surveillance, I think it's a mistake to limit this much broader issue of surveillance as we go, sometimes because it needs to be done in order for the systems to operate as a backdrop for the privacy requirements we have. So I still haven't seen anything that provides any, any semblance of a roadmap for how to address those global issues, or even how to look at them. The combination of personal data, correct and incorrect data, machine-to-machine data, data that is old and data that is currently up-to-date. I think this is something where we need to really start from scratch to understand what the most important issues are, how they could be regulated, how they could be addressed through the technology. At this point, we don't even know, at least from my readings, what the real issues are.
Well, I have to share your cynicism. So I'm as cynical about this whole thing because, I mean, GDPR is only about companies. It doesn't regulate anything that the BND would be doing. And if the BND gets to filter all the information, if they get it, it doesn't really help much if the company afterwards, where the data is addressed, is very careful about it. At the same time, now comes into that I'm the technologist of the panel, I see this as a great motivation to build better systems, so that even if the agencies get their hand on it, it should be useless to them. I'm not saying they're succeeding in that, but at least it means I have to push harder, I have to make sure I can't just rely on the policy. But it's still good to have the policy. It shows the direction.
Actually, I have the same point of view. I share your concerns. I have no answer to what you said. But again, indeed, I think that we can do as much as we can do with legislation and regulation. And then that's why technology is also very important in this whole game. And also, I think that users also have their own part in this whole discussion, and they should be able also to have tools that they can protect themselves, so independently of data controllers and GDPR, to be able to use tools, for example, for private communications and for browsing online anonymously. This whole area of privacy enhancing technology tools, I think is a very important area, and we should continue going into this direction. I think GDPR only helps towards this direction, but for sure it cannot solve this type of problems that are, in a way, above and beyond us, I believe.
You hear that individuals are being responsible.
Sorry?
Individuals are being responsible.
Right, yes, and I mean, on that, the difficulty here is just that individuals will hardly know what to protect themselves from. Especially when we're talking about government surveillance and transnational surveillance, and as proposed third category of surveillance we were talking about earlier today as well. So, I mean, yes, individuals should be given as much information as possible, as what kind of information they should be careful with and how they use it. I think that is always something that we should promote. But then again, since we only find out about how surveillance usually is conducted through mass leaks that then are also deemed illegal one way or another, it's very difficult to put that kind of responsibility on an individual, and therefore it's a very positive move that we put more effort, or we demand and require more effort of corporations and companies to make sure that the data is protected. But yeah, perhaps this comes down to a question of who actually does own the data. I mean, GDPR does try to forward some kind of understanding that you are a data subject, you are a data owner, but in the end, are you really through GDPR? That's something I would love to hear also others input on.
Anybody wants to respond to that? Maybe it's a legal question?
Well, not a lawyer either, but I think that when a company processes data, they own the data in the context of this processing, in the sense that you have to provide them in order to get the service, for example. But of course, I think what the GDPR is not trying to say the contrary or anything, but is trying to protect the rights of the people that are providing their data. And in that sense, data subjects, as they are called in GDPR, they do have the right, for example, to delete their data, as was mentioned earlier, of course, under certain conditions and circumstances, or they do have the right to say, I don't want my data to be processed anymore. And because at the end, they also are owners of this data as well. So it's, I think, when you are part of, when you agree to participate in a process or operation to give your data in order to get a service, you have to accept that as part of the service. But I think what this legislation provides is some safeguards that still, however, the owners, the real owners of the data subjects can have still control over this data, and it's not that they give them away and that's all. That's it. I think that's the point of this legislation.
Okay, thank you. I propose we close the panel here, so please join me in thanking the panelists for a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.